Ghost Story, The Fading Scent. Author, Tu Hak Bok. In Haojong, every rice season there are usually 3 crops grown continuously all year round. Perhaps the most beautiful is the ripe rice season around the beginning of June. During this month, the vast rice fields are divided into many small plots intertwined with each other. Create a vivid image that captivates people's hearts. And then every harvest season, farmers enthusiastically lead each other to the fields to harvest rice. Among those farmers are the families of Thanh Nhan and Mr. Ha. Thanh Nhan just turned 18 years old this year. The age is considered the most beautiful for a girl. In Vai Tui district, Thanh Nhan is considered the most beautiful beauty. Not only in my district but also in other districts, it is difficult to find a girl with both beauty and good manners like her. But she herself doesn't care much about herself. For Thanh Nhan, her family always comes first. Since she was a child, she lived with her mother, so it's not surprising. When she inherited all of her grandmother's beauty and gentle and hardworking personality, and her father sacrificed himself to protect the country, and now in this house, only mother and child are left to rely on into each other. Ha, about 20 years old this year, is a farmer who also lives in the same district as Thanh Nhan, whose families are not far apart. Ha is originally a tall guy with a handsome face, but his skin is dark. Always go to the fields. But he didn't feel ashamed because he knew that when he worked as a farmer, he sold his face to the land and his back to the sky. If you're outside in the sun and rain all the time, how can you avoid having dark skin? Even so, he is a person who also works hard to take care of his elderly father, and it can be said that he is even happier when Thanh Nhan pays attention to him. Both families have been together for many years. From when Thanh Nhan and Ha were still young, until they both grew up, they became even more agitated. Like childhood and childhood. Much later, until one day when the two of them finished working in the fields, they came to a romantic lake in the district not far from the fields. The surrounding shore was filled with dry leaves falling down and fluttering with the wind. With the calm surface of the lake and the clear water in the distance, there are still a few people sitting and fishing, looking very peaceful, and it must be said that the scenery here has a wild, quiet beauty that attracts anyone who comes here. One must be ecstatic. They were both sitting under a large, ancient almond tree with a gentle breeze blowing, the long branches reaching out to cover the harsh sunlight, making them both feel cool and comfortable. Don Ha suddenly grabbed Thanh Nhan's hand and said lovingly, "Thanh Nhan, thank you." Suddenly hearing him say that, she looked at him bewildered for a few seconds, then quickly smiled and asked, "Ha? What's wrong with you now? Why are you suddenly thanking me?" "I thank you because you came to me. Hey." Saying this, he hesitated for a few seconds, then sighed and said, "Honey, I'm planning to go abroad to work to earn a living. I'm thinking, if I stay here and work all year round with a few things like this, then who knows when I'll be able to get better. I'll try my best to make a lot of money when I go to the beach so that you and Mom won't have to suffer anymore in the future. What do you think?" After Thanh Nhan listened, his happy eyes suddenly became sad, the initially happy atmosphere suddenly turned cold. Thanh Nhan held dry leaves in his hand and kept turning them over as if he was thinking about something. Suddenly she turned to Ha and spoke with a slightly trembling voice. "Did you really decide to go? Did I do something to make you angry? Can you please not go?" "Sigh, Thanh Nhan, listen to me, I love Nan so much, I'm never angry with you. I decided to work far away because I want to take care of our future. Do you understand? Don't worry, I'll be back soon." Saying this, he moved closer and placed a kiss on her forehead. At that moment, Thanh Nhan's tears gently fell because she knew that soon she and he would have to leave each other, but because her love for him was too great. So she had to wipe away her tears and accept to let Ha go. Before the two went to work in the fields, Thanh Nhan pointed to the pond and said, "Hey, promise me you'll definitely come back. If you don't come back, I'll drown in this lake, promise." Ha looked down at the clear blue lake and suddenly he burst out laughing, holding her hand tightly and saying, "Okay, I promise you, I will definitely come back. Don't think too much anymore. Let's keep going so we can go home early." When Thanh Nhan heard him swear like that, she immediately smiled brightly, no longer as quiet as before. That afternoon, Thanh Nhan said goodbye to Ha to return home. As soon as she arrived in front of the yard, she heard the radio playing a sad song somewhere. Then she became sad and wandered around, no longer sitting and applying makeup. Let the fragrance fade to the point of fading. The days are always withering. The flowers are not fresh when you know she doesn't talk much. The birds stopped singing. As soon as she heard it, Thanh Nhan felt sad inside, but she didn't understand why she had such a feeling. She quickly blinked her eyes and walked into the house to take off the discolored conical hat she was wearing. She lowered her head and looked around, fanning herself while speaking loudly. "Mom, I'm home." Behind the kitchen, Mrs. Vi was boiling a bunch of water spinach and heard her daughter raise her head and speak. "Oh, Mom is in the kitchen right now, wait a minute." Hearing her mother's answer, she smiled and said yes, then sat down on a wooden chair and poured herself a glass of water. Then she poured another glass and took it down to the kitchen to see her mother squatting down to put more dry firewood into the stove. She quickly ran back and said, "Mom, let me help you so you can go home and rest when you're still tired." Mrs. Vi heard her daughter urging her to go home and rest, so she complied, stood up, looked at her and smiled. "Oh, okay, now tell me slowly, why are you pulling my mother's hand up?" Mom feels better now, so she went to the kitchen and grabbed a pot of porridge to boil a bunch of water spinach and make a bowl of braised fish sauce for now. Mom knows that I like to eat braised fish sauce very much, so that's why I made it. Thanh Nhan didn't need to listen to her grandmother's words, she could smell the smell of braised fish sauce and the steaming pot of porridge that suddenly made her stomach rumble. Then she gave her a glass of water to drink and finished cooking. Took her clothes, took a shower, then returned to the kitchen to prepare a simple tray of porridge. Both mother and daughter were eating and chatting happily. While eating, Mrs. Vi saw that her daughter's face looked very sad. She asked curiously, "Hey Nan, do you have something to say? Why do you look so sad? Tell me if there's anything. Don't hide it now, Mom." "Yes, it's nothing Mom, don't worry, your daughter always loves life." "Mom, look." Having said that, Thanh Nhan immediately looked at her with a bright smile. Seeing that, she didn't ask anymore. Both mother and child finished eating. Thanh Nhan took the tray down to the kitchen to clean up. A moment later she brought it up from the kitchen. "1 cup of medicine given to my mother." After drinking, she talked to her a few more words and then returned to her room. Lying on Thanh Nhan's bed, suddenly unable to sleep, she remembered Ha's words at noon today and wished that time would pass quickly so that Ha could return to her side soon. She suddenly remembered that not long ago, Mr. Khan, Ha's father, had mentioned the two of them getting married, but because their families were still in so much trouble, they didn't have much money. So Ha suggested trying to work for a few more years until she had enough money and then it wouldn't be too late to get married. When Thanh Nhan heard him say that, she was very happy. But then Ha didn't think like him, so at first his words made her a little disappointed. But because she loves him very much and believes that sooner or later they will both get married, so she felt secure and wholeheartedly stayed by his side. Until today, when Thanh Nhan heard Ha say she was going to work far away, her confidence suddenly became a bit shaken. Never in her life had she felt such anxiety. It was getting late outside and she lay in bed for a while and then gradually fell asleep. A few months later, Ha completed the procedures to go abroad to work. One afternoon, before he left tomorrow, the two of them met on the familiar lakeside and sat under an almond tree for nearly half an hour. Both still sat silently without saying anything. And then suddenly Ha turned to look Thanh Nhan straight in the face and said, "Honey, I'm leaving tomorrow, you'll stay here and take care of Mom and Dad for me." Thanh Nhan remained silent, not saying anything, her hands tightly grasping her faded shirt. Tears were streaming down her oval face. Seeing this, Ha moved closer to her and gently grabbed the two tables. Her hands, which were calloused from working in the fields, comforted her. "I know you're sad, I love you as much as I love my parents. I'll only be there for 3 years. I'll try to work hard to save up some money, and then when I come back, I'll do whatever I want to do. It's all so easier." After saying that, Ha saw her sobbing again, so he continued. "I promise that after returning, I will make it up to you, I will marry you, build a more spacious house for you and Dad to have a full life." Thanh Nhan heard Ha talk about the rich prospects of the two of them, and in the sobbing heart of a teenage girl, the images of a bright future partly made her burst into tears of joy. Thanh Nhan looked at her straight into Ha's face and smiled widely, revealing her dimpled cheeks and teeth as white as corn kernels, her hair fluttering with each passing breeze. She looked even more beautiful now, sitting with her head resting on Ha's shoulder. Seeing that, he also put his arm around her shoulder and hugged her. The two happily sat together, looking far away at the lake shore, settling with each beat of their emotions. The next morning, Thanh Nhan woke up early to prepare some food so Ha could have something to eat and drink later on the road. Mrs. Vi was still sleeping when she heard the noise in the kitchen. She sat up and walked out. "Behind the house, I saw my daughter busy wrapping up some rice balls along with some braised fish that Ha really liked to eat." Looking at her, she suddenly remembered her husband, Mr. Man. In the past, it was very difficult for the two of them to be together, but it seemed that God did not please people, when that year the war became more and more tense. More than Mr. Man, he had to go to the battlefield. Before he left, she, like Thanh Nhan, took the opportunity to wake up early to cook some food for Mr. Man so that he could have something to eat on the way, because she knew that being in the army was a tough job. Living a miserable life does not always mean having enough food and drink. While recalling the memories, suddenly Mrs. Vi heard a voice calling, "Mom! Mom, Mom, what's wrong?" Calling Thanh Nhan, she shook her hand, causing Mrs. Vi to suddenly wake up and ask again in bewilderment. Listen Mom, what do we say now? Why are you suddenly standing here dumbfounded?" "I called out but Mom didn't hear anything." "Oh, it's nothing, I'm just a little dizzy, after a while I'll apply some oil and I'll be fine again." "Ha! Are you preparing food for Ha now? When will it go?" "He won't be leaving for another hour, so I'll wake up early and cook some food for him to eat along the way." "Is that so? But now, hurry up and go quickly or you'll be late. Now, remember to send my regards to Mr. Khan and him. I'll come visit him in a few days. Now that Ha is gone so far, I don't know how Mr. Khan will live in the future." Hayes. Thanh Nhan felt a bit sad when she heard this. From the beginning, she considered Mr. Khan as her father. Every time he felt unwell, Thanh Nhan was always the one to visit and take care of him. And Mr. Khan has long considered her as his daughter-in-law. Even though the two families have not yet had a wedding ceremony, the way she takes care of Mr. Khan and loves Ha partly proves that. Listening to Thanh Nhan's mother's words, she obeyed, then quickly carried her arms under her arms, put on a hat, and quickly went to Ha's house. On the way to meet an acquaintance, Thanh Nhan only said a quick hello and continued on, not being able to stay for a long time. Later, she arrived in front of the bamboo fence door of Ha's house, just as Mr. Khan came out of Mr. Khan's house carrying a bucket of water. When Thanh Nhan saw him, he happily called out, "Uncle Khan, I'm here." Mr. Khan, carrying a bucket of water in his hand, heard a familiar voice calling him, immediately looked outside the fence and saw Thanh Nhan. He immediately became excited. "Is that leisure now? Go inside the house quickly, it's very strange, why are you standing outside calling me like that?" As she walked, her mouth smiled brightly. Once inside, she took off her conical hat and waved it to cool off the heat. When she couldn't see Ha, she turned to Mr. Khan and asked, Uncle, isn't Mr. Ha at home?" Mr. Khan sat down on the chair and was about to pour her a glass of water when Thanh Nhan stopped him. "Hey, Uncle, I can pour it myself, please sit down and rest." When Mr. Khan heard that, he frowned and replied, "Father, at this moment you still call me uncle. No matter how many times Dad told me to just call Dad, since Ha's mother was still alive, Dad and her have considered us daughter-in-law and daughter-in-law in the family. Now, if you call me a jerk, I'll be angry." Thanh Nhan blushed, smiled, scratched her head, looked at him and said, "Yes Dad, I. Hee, there, isn't that easier to hear? Okay, let's call it that. Oh, now let's sit and play for a bit, Ha is packing his things in that room and he'll come out soon." Thanh Nhan agreed and sat on the chair to chat with him. More than 5 minutes later, Ha came out of the room to the front of the house. Seeing that Thanh Nhan had been sitting with her father, he smiled and said, "Ha, since when did you come here? Why don't you call and let me know?" When Mr. Khan saw his son leaving, he quickly stood up and went to the front yard to give the two of them space. Thanh Nhan looked behind him for a few seconds and then turned to Ha. "Thui, let me focus on packing and then we won't be too late to meet. Have you finished arranging your things yet?" "Hell, I finished preparing, now I suddenly feel hungry, so in the morning I was busy packing but I forgot to eat." "I knew you would forget to eat, but luckily I prepared it for you in the morning." While blaming Thanh Nhan, she took out a bag of rice balls from the bamboo basket along with cabbage soup and braised fish with pepper. Ha saw the food placed on the table and immediately burst out laughing. "It's all the food you like, just looking at it makes my stomach beat like a drum. Thank you." After speaking, Ha quickly sat down without saying a word, took out the rice ball and sat down naturally. Thanh Nhan sat there looking at him but felt sad. When he finished eating, he quickly looked up at the clock and saw that it was time. Ha hurriedly stood up and ran into the room to quickly change her clothes. More than 10 minutes later, Thanh Nhan and Mr. Khan sent Ha off to the main road to wait for the bus to the city. Although both of them wanted to follow him to the city to send him off one more time, Ha did not agree. "It's okay, Dad and Nan can take me here and then follow me to the city, I'm tired of going there." "Dad, don't worry, I'll work for 3 years and then I'll return home. I'm not worried about leaving forever." The three of them stood on the sidelines and waited for a while longer, then from a distance the bus gradually appeared. Ha quickly turned around to look at both of them with tears streaming down his face, but he tried to suppress his emotions so as not to cry. Mr. Khan. Looking at his son, although he was not crying, his mouth trembled slightly, unable to speak, he could only look at him with his old eyes, with gray hair. As for Thanh Nhan, when she saw the car coming, she knew she was about to leave him, so when Ha turned around, she immediately leaned forward and hugged him tightly. Tears began to fall, her voice trembling with emotion. "Mr. Ha, can you please stop going? I really don't want you to go anywhere, maybe you should think again." He heard her crying and saying that. Suddenly he pulled her away with both hands and said seriously, "Hey, listen to me, if you stay here, you won't have a future. All the money you've spent on this trip, if you're reluctant to stay now, your future life will be worse. It will be even more difficult for us. Do you understand? I promise I will definitely come back. You stay and take care of Mom and Dad for me. Stop crying. You go and come back." Hearing this, Thanh Nhan nodded slightly. Ha saw that she was no longer crying, so he raised his hand to wipe away the remaining tears on her cheeks and smiled. Meanwhile, the bus had just arrived and parked next to the three people. A young man immediately ran down and asked a few questions, then urged him to get on the bus quickly. Hearing that, he hummed and walked over to hug Mr. Khan and Thanh tightly. Nan once more, then immediately turned around and quickly got into the car. As soon as the car rolled away, Ha saw Thanh Nhan running behind the car, waving his hand and saying loudly, "Mr. Ha, you must come back to me and my parents. I will be waiting for you." However, in the car, Ha could not hear clearly what she had just said. Because around him, the car passengers were still talking loudly and the sound of the car engine kept ringing, creating mixed sounds. Thanh Nhan followed the car a little further, then she stopped because she was exhausted, breathing heavily, looking at the bus that was slowly moving away and then gradually disappearing behind a turn. Mr. Khan at that time, because of his old age, could not run. Following her, he slowly walked up to her and raised his hand to beckon. "Nan, let's go home, it's very sunny out here." Thanh Nhan was still standing there, looking far away on the large dirt road. Occasionally a few motorbikes and bicycles passed by, but she didn't pay attention. Until Mr. Khan's voice was approaching, Thanh Nhan suddenly woke up. When he woke up, he quickly turned his head to look at Mr. Khan and then spoke again. "Yes, I heard you, Dad, I'll be right back." After speaking, she stood leisurely and looked in the direction the bus had just gone. Once again she suddenly mumbled in her mouth, "Mr. Ha, I will definitely return there." Then she quietly turned around and followed Mr. Khan back home. Since the day Ha went abroad, he occasionally wrote letters to ask about her health, said many things and sent some money back to Thanh Nhan and his father. The first time she received Ha's letter, I was very happy to know that he was there, although his work was very busy, but in exchange for a lot of salary, his life was not as difficult as many other people here. In Ha's letter, he also said that at the end of the year he will ask for leave to return to Vietnam to visit her and her parents. Thanh Nhan is very happy reading this and is confident that Ha will return to her. But she thought that happiness would last forever until the end of the year when she did not see Ha return. Didn't receive any letter. Thanh Nhan was impatient and couldn't sit still. Every day after finishing her farm work, she went out on the road to wait for Ha. And then it seemed like more than 2 years had passed. At that time, Thanh Nhan is also 20 years old, the age considered the most mature and sharpest in a girl's life. During that time, many boys in Vai Tui district and other districts tried to pursue her. But Thanh Nhan has a stubborn personality and is determined not to accept love from anyone. Just waiting for Ha because she still believes that he will definitely return to her. As for Mr. Khan, he still hasn't seen his son right back for a long time, so he's very worried. Every day he burns incense and prays to his wife to keep his son safe in a foreign land. As for Mrs. Vai, every day she saw her daughter eating little and working a lot. After finishing her work, she went out to the street to wait, which made her feel very sad. One day, she struggled to go out to the street to find Thanh Nhan. Suddenly she saw her standing under a large bougainvillea tree, waiting for Mrs. Vai to walk up to her with her cane in hand and then speak. "Nan, go home with your mother. Every day I come here and wait. I don't know when Ha will come back. Go home. When will Ha come back? It will meet you no matter what." Thanh Nhan was standing with her back against the bougainvillea tree when she heard her grandmother's voice. She turned to look in surprise because she didn't think that her mother could be out here. Because she was old now and couldn't walk or stand for long, she quickly ran over to help her hand and said worriedly, Mom? Why don't you stay at home instead of coming here?" When Mrs. Vi heard that, she sighed and kept repeating the old refrain. "Nan, go home with Mom. If Ha comes back he will definitely come to see you. Now why do you have to come here every day and wait so hard? Come home with Mom." When Thanh Nhan heard her mother complain, she hesitated for a second, but then she followed her old mother's words and returned home. "Mr. Ha, it's noon, take a break and continue working." Ha was checking some boxes of goods to deliver them to customers in time when suddenly he heard a familiar voice from behind. He turned slightly to look, and the person running in front of him was none other than Conti, the beloved daughter of the owner of the facility where he works. From the first day he set foot in the land of the Ha people, he bewilderedly looked at the modern streets with beautifully and luxuriously dressed people who were completely different from him, a farmer who only knew about growing crops and raising livestock and other things. He was completely unfamiliar to him. Following Ha were several men and women along with a tall man in his 30s, dressed politely, carrying a black briefcase. He led everyone to the home appliance manufacturing facility is located on the outskirts of the city. Fortunately, the owner of the facility is also a Vietnamese. His name is Viet because his growing facility needs to hire some cheap workers, so he contacted a broker in Vietnam to help him find one. About 10 smart people came here to work. He took care of all the procedures and expenses. After talking with the broker, Mr. Viet gave him an envelope and said thank you. Then he called everyone in to meet the boss. Mr. Viet took a quick look at each person's appearance and checked their abilities, then he smiled and nodded with satisfaction, and right from the beginning of work, Ha proved to be very diligent. Being eager to learn, he soon caught the attention of Mr. Viet, and created conditions for his daughter to interact with him. At first, Ha didn't pay attention to Conti, but every day when he saw her he worriedly asked about her, sometimes even taking him here and there to let him know that she had feelings for him, but because in his heart he already had Thanh Nhan doesn't want to make her sad. Thinking so, he decided to tell her that he had a lover back home. And the next afternoon when everyone had left, only Ha was left in the office arranging some papers to hand over to Mr. Viet. Then suddenly Conti walked in holding a pre-peeled fruit. Seeing Ha, she smiled brightly and said, "Mr. Ha, have you rested yet? I brought you fruit, please eat it." Ha had just finished folding the papers and saw her placing a box of fruit on his desk. Suddenly looked at her and then froze for a moment because in front of him Conti was dressed luxuriously and luxuriously, her face was beautifully made up, her long, softly curled hair combined with a unique scent of perfume made Ha fall in love with her. Ecstatic. For a moment, he suddenly forgot about Thanh Nhan, seeing him keep staring at her. Conti blushed, turned to the side, clasped her hands together and spoke softly. "Hey, why are you looking at me so fiercely? Is there something on your face?" Hearing Ms. Ha's voice made him even more passionate, and suddenly he woke up, looked embarrassed, scratched his head and said, "Oh, no, there's nothing wrong with your face, because I thought you looked so beautiful today that I almost didn't recognize you." Hearing him say that, Conti suddenly smiled brighter. "Really? Are you really beautiful? Don't tease me, am I beautiful like that?" "Yes, I'm serious, you look so beautiful, like a princess." Conti's face suddenly turned red with joy because this was the first time she heard a compliment from Ha herself. Before, she rarely wore makeup, so she didn't know that she had a hidden beauty. Just hide like that. Just now she went to the hairdresser to change her appearance, hoping to make Ha notice her. By the time her makeup was done and her hair was done, she herself sometimes didn't recognize herself. "When I looked in the mirror and now when I stand here I see Ha focusing on me." She felt very happy, then suddenly remembered something. Conti looked at Ha and said softly, "Hey Ha, today is my birthday, I wonder if you can. When she said this, Ha immediately interrupted. Is today your birthday? I'm sorry, I didn't know, otherwise I would have bought you a gift. Now tell me what you like and I'll run and buy it right away. Yes, okay, I don't like anything, I just need you to follow me home to celebrate my birthday party with my family, is that okay? Ha heard that, without thinking he replied. Yeah, okay, why not? It's my birthday and you have to be there, okay, I'll wait a bit for you. Saying that, Ha quickly took a stack of papers and urged her to go out. After returning to his rented room, he took a shower, chose a clean set of pants and a shirt, put it on and quickly walked out. Follow Con T to her house. At a lavish birthday party full of her friends and some of Mr. Viet's customers, in the middle of the party Con T pulled Ha to stand next to her in front of everyone. She declared that Ha was her lover. When everyone heard that, they looked at Ha in surprise. They had to admit that since he came here, his appearance had changed significantly, his skin was no longer as dark as before, his face was typical. The boy exuded a luxurious look when wearing a suit that Con T had bought for him just now. Because seeing that the outfit he was wearing earlier was too casual, she was afraid that she would displease her parents. Now, in front of everyone, Con T and Ha looked like a talented couple. With the support of the Vietnamese couple, it can be said that this is the happiest birthday of her life. Since then, he and Con T have become more and more attached to each other, and his work has also improved very quickly. Soon, Ha no longer wrote letters to Vietnam, promising to return to him. Thanh Nhan, because of that, gradually faded away because in his mind, in addition to having a lot of money, he also needed to have relationships outside of society, especially the authority that he now had. Meanwhile, Thanh Nhan was still waiting patiently for Ha to return. Gradually, she was no longer as lively and smiling as before, instead she had a sad face without any vitality, her mother. Seeing my daughter like that was very painful because I knew she loved Ha very much, and it was not easy to give up on him. One evening, while Mrs. Vi was lighting incense for her husband, she saw her walking into his face from the yard. Pale because she hadn't eaten or drank anything, she called her back to her chair and sat down to choose her words and advise her. Nan, there's something I want to tell you. Seeing you sad all day makes me worried. Now listen to Mom, don't. Before she could finish her sentence, Thanh Nhan interrupted her. Okay Mom, I will never marry anyone except Ha, I believe that he will definitely come back to me. He made a promise to me, I believe he won't go back on his word. Mom, don't advise me anymore. Thuy, I'm tired so please let my mom go to the room to rest. Mom, remember to go to bed early. As soon as she finished speaking, without waiting for her to say anything else, she quickly stood up and went into her room. Mrs. Vi sat outside looking at her back, her face suddenly filled with tears, she was scared. If she continued like this forever, she would be exhausted. Thinking so, she stood up, walked to the altar of her husband, and clasped her hands together to pray, her voice trembling. Grandpa, please remember to bless my child Nan, I'm already suffering and I don't want him to suffer like me anymore. Looking at it like that makes my heart hurt so much, man. I ask you to please bless him. After praying for a while longer, Ms. Vi raised her head and sighed, then tiredly walked slowly into her room. 2 weeks later, in the afternoon after Thanh Nhan returned from working in the fields, she stopped by Mr. Khan's house as usual, visiting him and waiting to see if Ha had written a letter or not. When she was just outside the fence of Ha's house, she saw a young man wearing a hat and carrying a bag on a bicycle. Seeing that, she happily ran quickly because she thought he was coming to deliver Ha's letter. In fact, as soon as he saw Thanh Nhan, he immediately waved. The hand called her. Miss Nan, I have a letter for you from Mr. Ha. When Thanh Nhan heard that, she shed tears of joy and ran over, holding the envelope in her hand, and hurried into the house without informing Mr. Khan. "Dad, Mr. Ha has sent a letter, please come here quickly." Mr. Khan was in the kitchen at that time boiling tea to make tea. When he heard Thanh Nhan's voice, he ran out excitedly but forgot to bring the teapot. Seeing her, he immediately said impatiently, "Ha, what now? Did Ha send a letter? Now read it to Dad quickly, let's see what he said that he just sent now." Thanh Nhan was just as nervous as him. Hearing him urge her to obey, she helped him sit down on the chair, then tore open the cover and took out the letter to read. When she read the middle of the letter, she was so shocked that her heart stopped beating. Her trembling hands relaxed and she dropped the letter to the ground. Mr. Khan was listening attentively to the part she read halfway when he was surprised to see her face change. He asked bewilderedly, "Ha? Why don't you continue reading now, what's wrong? Nan, why is your face so pale? Is there something wrong? Tell me now." Thanh Nhan. She was still sitting blankly on the chair, her eyes staring blankly at the table. Mr. Khan had to call her name 2 or 3 more times before she woke up. She looked at him and without saying a word, she buried her face under the table and cried. Her cry was so loud that several people passing by the house heard it and had to curiously look at it. But then they realized it wasn't their business, so they moved on. Even though her cries still rang out endlessly. Mr. Khan, sitting opposite her, was surprised by this situation, making him confused and not understanding what was going on. After a few awkward seconds, he calmed down and stood up, walked over to Thanh Nhan, sat down next to her, and shook her shoulders. "Hey Nan, what is happening now that makes you suddenly cry so loudly? Please don't cry anymore, if there's anything, please slowly tell me. Okay, don't cry anymore." While reassuring Mr. Khan, he rubbed her head. Seeing him sitting next to her, she felt even more sad and cried even harder. Immediately turned around and put her face on his shoulder. Mr. Khan comforted him and rubbed his head. Suddenly Thanh Nhan suppressed her emotions, leaned up to look at him and said with tears in her eyes, Dad, Mr. Ha. He's about to get married to someone else." Having said that, Thanh Nhan once again burst into tears and laid her face on Mr. Khan's shoulder. Hearing her speak, he immediately felt confused, never thinking that his son would be the one to change his mind like that. Mr. Khan aimed. He breathed again to regain composure, then he raised his hand to pat her shoulder and reassure her. "Hey, it's probably not like that, my child, calm down now. I understand Ha's personality very well, he's not a treacherous person. Don't worry now, I'm here, and if he dares to betray me, I will beat him without even looking at him. Okay Nan, now don't cry anymore." Hearing Mr. Thanh Nhan's words, she felt like she was given a little more strength, so she stopped crying, looked up at him, then sobbed again. Dad, why is my fate so miserable? Dad, I've been waiting for him for so long, why does he treat me like that, Dad?" Mr. Khan didn't say anything, he could only sigh and looked at her with sympathetic eyes, his hand caressing the long straight hair of the girl that he had long considered her to be his daughter-in-law in his family. From the day Ha went abroad to work until she returned, more than 4 years passed. On Sunday morning, a 16-seat car drove on an asphalted road. More than 15 minutes later the car pulled over. Parking in front of the alley leading into the neighborhood, getting out of the car was a politely dressed young man carrying a large suitcase. As soon as he entered the alley, there was a woman in her 50s wearing a brown baba shirt. Sitting on the porch eating betel. When she saw him, she was curious because she had lived here for a long time and had never seen anyone dressed elegantly entering this neighborhood. Most of the people living here were farmers working in the fields and raising livestock. Only raised. Now suddenly seeing a stranger coming in, she wondered, but being an honest person, she spoke up and asked. "What are you doing? Are you looking for someone in this area?" The young man heard the question and immediately turned to the left to find that voice. He looked through the wire fence and saw a woman sitting on the porch eating betel, looking at him. Thinking for a moment, he suddenly looked at her and waved. Hands rang. "Ha! Can I ask if you are Mrs. Five Beetle? Don't you recognize me?" "Hey ha, Uncle Khan's son ha in our neighborhood. In the past I used to sneak into Grandma's Longan garden to steal and she chased me. Do you remember me?" When Mrs. Five heard that, she quickly stood up, walked closer to the fence, squinted her eyes to look closely, then suddenly her eyes widened and she exclaimed. "Ah, so it's Ha. Oh my gosh, I look so different now that I almost don't recognize it. How did you get there now? Is it very extreme?" Yes, it's a bit hard to work so much, so I'm on vacation so I came here to visit my father and neighbors." Where is Mr. Five, ma'am?" "He's going out to the fields and I'll bring him some food in a little while, but I'm happy to be back now." "Hurry up and visit your father, he must be very happy to see your face now." "Oh, yes, hello, may I please go home, Five children?" After speaking, Ha smiled and bowed to her, then turned around and walked into the alley, catching her looking at him with her old eyes, feeling sad. Going a few hundred meters further, Ha saw his simple house in front of him. Suddenly, old memories rushed back into his mind, making him feel indescribably nauseous and quickly walked faster. When he reached the fence gate in front of Ha's house, he immediately called out. "Dad, I'm home. Open the door for me, my dear." There was no answer. Ha had to call 2 or 3 more times, then inside Mr. Khan's house, holding a cane, he slowly walked out, his face a bit sad and not happy to hear that he had returned. Ha stood outside the gate to see him. His father seemed unusual today. He wondered. When Mr. Khan opened the door, he saw this and asked worriedly. Dad? What's wrong with Tia? Are you sick?" "Dad doesn't feel well, so tell me to walk." "Oh, no, I'm fine, now go home, you must be very tired on the way, right?" "Yes, I'm a little tired, but when I get home I feel fine, so let me go inside and close the door for you." Saying this, Ha turned around, closed the door, then helped him into the house. As soon as he sat down on the chair, he quickly poured him a glass of water and placed it in front of him. Seeing him muttering without saying a word, he asked in bewilderment. "Dad, what's wrong? Why do you think I'm so sad? Tell me." When Mr. Khan heard him ask, he sighed, picked up the glass of water, took a sip, then looked at his son and slowly replied with a sad voice. "Nan, it's Nan." Hearing Nan's name, Ha suddenly opened her eyes and looked at him and urged him. "What's wrong with Ton Nan, Dad?" "Nan, he's dead." Hearing this, he was stunned and sat silent without saying anything. A few minutes later, Ha suddenly regained composure and lowered his face and asked softly. "Ton Nan, how did you die, Dad?" Mr. Khan sighed again and turned his head to look outside. He suddenly closed his eyes as if to recall the painful incident that happened 2 months ago. After learning that Ha was about to get married to another girl, Ton Nan seemed to no longer have the mind to think about anything else. She kept wandering around in the morning, going to the fields, and returning home in the afternoon to eat and drink lightly and lock herself up. She found herself in a dark room, then lay down on her pillow and sobbed. After crying, she was tired and fell asleep. Just like that, in just a short time, her face became visibly haggard, and everyone who saw her felt sorry for her. Not a single beautiful and vivacious girl has become a quiet person who doesn't interact with anyone. Even her mother, Vi, tried to comfort and encourage her, but she didn't pay any attention to it, making her cry. She shed tears every day and could only pray for her husband to bless her daughter. But then one night when Thanh Nhan was dozing off to sleep, she suddenly heard a voice echoing somewhere, sounding tragic and equally magical. Then his grave was next to hers like the old vow. Lying lonely until autumn. Sleep in a deep dry earth grave. Over the years, green moss has covered it. You don't have incense or smoke. When the weather is bad, there are no leaves left on the trees. Those green leaves have fallen. The resounding sound of a girl singing suddenly made her suddenly wake up, sit up and look out the window. In the middle of the night, under the light of the full moon night of the 16th, she saw a glimpse in the area. The neighbor's Longan garden has the silhouette of a girl sitting and swinging in a hammock with both ends attached to two Longan tree trunks. She rubbed her eyes in confusion and looked closely, and clearly she still saw that girl. Sitting and swaying, her mouth was still singing, but something made Thanh Nhan wonder. Why did she sing so loudly but no one heard her, and who was that girl at this hour? Why does singing in the garden sound so tragic? Thinking about it, she was curious and went out to see who it was that had just walked into the garden. Then the girl suddenly became silent and stopped singing, as if she knew someone was secretly listening to her sing. Suddenly she jumped down into the hammock and turned her back to Thanh Nhan. She immediately ran away, making Thanh Nhan startled and stand looking after her. And then she suddenly wondered if maybe she was planning to do something foolish. Without thinking too much, Thanh Nhan immediately ran in the direction of that girl. After running for a while, she came to the lakeside where she and Ha often used to go on dates in the past, standing and looking around. Suddenly, Thanh Nhan suddenly saw the silhouette of a man standing near the lake shore with his back facing her. That person's head bowed to the ground. She was confused, not knowing what he was standing there doing. She was about to step forward and ask a question when suddenly she heard a man's voice emitting a deep echo. Thanh Nhan. Hey Nan. Hearing her name being called, she was startled and opened her eyes to look behind the man. Then suddenly she stuttered and asked, "Who are you? How do you know my name?" "Here I am, it's my Ha, I'm coming back to you, don't you miss me?" As he spoke, the man slowly turned around. Thanh Nhan couldn't believe her eyes when she saw it. The person standing in front of her was none other than Ha. Tears welled up in her eyes and she asked, "Ha? Are you, Mr. Ha, is it really you?" "Yes, it's me, Nan, come with me, I'll be happy to bring you here, please follow me." Calling him, he lifted his foot and stepped into the lake. When Thanh Nhan saw this, she panicked and rushed over to try to pull him back in. Because in front of him was a very deep lake. She didn't understand why Ha suddenly stepped into the lake like that. When Thanh Nhan ran close to the lake shore, suddenly Ha shook her shoulders and burst into laughter. While Thanh Nhan was still bewildered, he turned his head. Looked at her again with two deep black eyes. His whole body was pale and sticky. Suddenly he laughed and said, "I caught you." As soon as she heard this, Thanh Nhan seemed captivated, so she slowly walked down to the lake. The farther she went, the deeper her body sank into the lake until she could no longer be seen. Early the next morning, when the sun had not yet appeared, there was a group of people holding sticks and torches to illuminate a section of the road, searching among the bushes of the garden behind them. They then followed the lake shore to search for the water hyacinths, were accompanied by the wailing of an austere woman, guided by an uncle beside her, Mrs. Vi and Mr. Khan. Last night, when Mrs. Vi was sleeping, she dreamed of Thanh Nhan standing right at the head of her bed. Her face was as pale as a banana leaf, looking sadly at her. She was a little startled and stammered. "Ask. Are you free now? What time is it? Why don't you go to sleep and come over here to find Mom?" Having said that, she sat up and tried to grab her hand and pull her closer, but suddenly Thanh Nhan stepped back and stood right at the door. She was bewildered and didn't understand why she was like that. Seeing her pale face, she asked worriedly, "Huh? What's wrong with your face? Why is your face so green? Come here so I can see." As she spoke, she stood up and walked closer when suddenly Thanh Nhan spoke to stop her. Her voice was trembling but the sound was deep and chilling. "Mom, don't come closer here." When she heard that voice, she suddenly stopped, her whole body suddenly felt cold as if immersed in ice water. She gritted her teeth and rubbed her body with her hands and asked, "What's up? Why don't you let me come over and see how it is now?" After saying that, she decided to walk towards her, but her legs now seemed to be held tightly by some invisible force, not allowing her to take any more steps. She frowned slightly, her whole body suddenly struggled but still. Unable to move, Mrs. Vi suddenly heard her daughter's voice sadly speaking through tears. "Mom, I'm sorry, you stay and take care of your health, now I have to go, I'm not filial and can't take care of you in your old age. I'm sorry." Speaking of this, Thanh Nhan's image slowly faded and disappeared into nothingness. After hearing it, Mrs. Vi witnessed her daughter's image disappearing in front of her. She panicked and screamed her daughter's name, then suddenly sitting up, she was sweating profusely down the back of her shirt. She was breathing heavily, placing her hand on her chest to calm herself down. She quietly looked outside the window and saw that it was still very dark. Outside, in the distance, the sounds of insects, frogs, and bullfrogs were chirping. She could hear it clearly. She sat on the bed, thinking vaguely for a moment. Then quickly stood up, holding an oil lamp, and walked over to Thanh Nhan's room to check. As soon as she entered the room, she saw that the door was wide open. She was startled and quickly walked inside, raising the lamp high to let the light shine more clearly. She saw that the room was empty and Thanh Nhan was no longer in the room. At this moment, Mrs. Vi suddenly remembered the dream she had just had of meeting her daughter, remembering her sad eyes and her apologetic words. She felt her intestines suddenly heat up like a fire without thinking much. She went into the room to get more clothes and put them on because outside, the cold night dew was still looming around the road. Then Mrs. Vi tried to drag her old body to Mr. Khan's house. As she walked, she looked around to see if she could see her daughter anywhere. But the surrounding scenery was now just dark black. No matter how tired she was, she finally arrived at Mr. Khan's front gate. Although it is now midnight, her daughter's strange disappearance makes her unable to think much. Then she thought of Mr. Khan's house, the only place she could go. She reassured herself that maybe Thanh Nhan had something to do, so she came to his house at this hour. But because she was afraid of disturbing her sleep, she quietly came here without telling her. Thinking so, but in order to feel secure, she had to bother Mr. Khan. Suddenly she looked inside the house and called out, "Brother Ba, Brother Ba." Mrs. Vi had to call for another 2 or 3 hours when suddenly a yellow light appeared in the house. She nervously opened her eyes and waited, then from behind the door Mr. Khan came out holding a rather large lamp. He stood right at the door, looked towards the figure standing right in front of the fence and asked questions. "Who's that? Who is out there?" Hearing Mr. Khan's question, she happily answered, "Mr. Ba, it's me Vi." "Oh, is that Mrs. Vi? Huh. It's late, did you come here to find me? What's wrong?" Mr. Khan asked as he walked to the gate and quickly unlocked it to let her in. Entering the door, she looked at him worriedly and asked, "Hey Ba, did Nan come to your house just now? I was sleeping and suddenly woke up and couldn't see him anywhere. I thought he was over at your house for something urgent, so I rushed here to see what was going on." "Yeah, but he didn't come to my house, oh my God, where did he go at this hour? Have you gone to ask the people around here? I didn't ask, but if it's not at your house then, oh my God, where did it go? Bah, you have to help me find it. I'm the only one left. If something happens to him, I probably won't be able to live, Dad. Speaking of this, Ms. Vi sat down with tears in her eyes as if she was about to cry. Seeing this, Mr. Khan said something to reassure her, then he helped her stand up and go into the house. As soon as he helped her sit down on the chair, Mr. Khan sighed and said, "You sit here, let me go out and ask some people to help me find Nan. If you come with me, I'm afraid it won't be convenient. Please calm down, whatever happens. Nan will be okay." After speaking, he poured her a glass of water, then quickly took the lantern and walked out, passing by the house of some people who asked him to help search for Nan. It was almost dawn when a group of people spread out to search the neighborhood but still couldn't find any trace of her. At that time, Mrs. Vi was anxious to know about her child, so she also ran out after the group to search. Until the sun was rising, the sound of a rooster crowing was heard. 3 people in the search group, an uncle and 2 young men, discovered the body of a girl floating face down in the water, entangled in the water. Inside the bushes along the lake, although the corpse was swollen, all 3 people easily recognized it as Nan with her light blue baba shirt. At this point, Mr. Khan couldn't hold back his tears, so he quickly raised his hand to wipe the corners of his eyes and continued sadly. "She is gentle and kind and beautiful, so why is God so unfair to her?" Saying this, he raised his eyes to look at Ha and then lowered his voice. "And now, tell me, are you about to get married to someone else? Who is that girl?" Hearing that, Ha remained silent and did not respond because his mind was now only thinking about Nan's death, because he did not think that she could do such a foolish thing. Ha's purpose was not simply to come here to visit his father, but he also wanted to make it clear to her to end the relationship between the two, giving him peace of mind to marry another girl, but he did not expect that when he came here, Nan is dead. Sitting for a while, Ha felt unwell, so he stood up and asked his father's permission to go into the room to rest. The next afternoon, Ha alone went to Nan's grave in the neighborhood cemetery. In my hand I carried a beautiful bouquet of flowers, along with a bunch of incense and some fruit. Looking at the newly built grave, he sighed softly, then walked to the grave, sat down, placed the bouquet of flowers in front of the stele, pulled out 3 sticks of incense, lit it, and then the smoke slowly rose. 3 incense sticks were burning hotly in his face. Squinting his eyes slightly, he struggled to put the incense down into the tiny incense burner and then suddenly spoke. "Nan, why did you do such a foolish thing? I'm sorry for not being able to keep my previous promise. Now it's over, I just hope you..." Speaking of this, Ha suddenly stopped because in front of him, the smoke from 3 incense sticks swirled from the top to the base of the incense sticks, accompanied by a stream of cold air blowing straight into the back of her head, making Ha suddenly shiver, raising her hand to rub it. At the same time, from the 3 incense sticks, fire suddenly flared up fiercely. The flame flickered for a few seconds then extinguished. Witnessing that terrifying scene in the deserted cemetery, Ha's face turned pale and her mouth faltered. Nan, if you are sacred, please testify for me. I just made a temporary mistake. Please rest in peace. I promise to take care of your mother for you. Please believe me. Is it leisurely?" When he prayed here, everything returned to normal. He no longer had the cold feeling running down his spine. Since that afternoon, he didn't know if it was because he was afraid or because he felt regretful, but every few days after that afternoon he would cry. Ha went to the grave once again. And every time he finished visiting the grave, he felt like he could sleep well that day, and then Ha's time coming back here to rest was almost over. A few days later, he felt like nothing was going to happen again, so Ha calmed down. I don't want to visit her grave anymore. But take advantage of the time to hang out with friends in the neighborhood until the last day before returning abroad. That morning, Ha had an appointment with his friends to go to the neighboring neighborhood to eat and drink because tomorrow at noon he had to say goodbye to everyone in the neighborhood to go back abroad. That night, Ha dreamed of a large black cat crawling from the roof through the gap under the roof, then slowly jumping down to stand right in front of Ha's bed. Startled, he raised his head to look and saw Thanh Nhan standing still right next to the bed in front of him, wearing the light blue ba shirt from the day he broke up with her to go on his journey. Her eyes sparkled slightly as she looked at him affectionately and then held out her hand. Although in her sleep, Ha knew that she was dead, he suddenly shivered and tried to turn and run away. But his body seemed frozen at this moment, just sitting on the bed, his eyes still not leaving her. Ha's mouth stuttered, wanting to say something, but she couldn't make a sound. Suddenly, Thanh Nhan's image changed to the pale, gray face of someone who had drowned. Her hair was drenched in water and stuck together, spitting drops onto her clothes. Then get out of bed. While trembling, Thanh Nhan suddenly burst into a strange laugh, causing Ha to sit up in panic. He glanced around the room. It turned out that everything up until now had just been a dream. Sitting panting, he wiped the sweat from his forehead and thought vaguely, maybe it was because of her sudden death that he was so haunted. A few minutes later, after regaining his composure, Ha slowly laid down and pulled the blanket from head to toe. Until midnight he fell asleep and fell into a peaceful sleep. Early the next morning, Ha asked her father for permission to go out for work. Instead of going to Thanh Nhan's grave to burn incense to apologize, Ha walked to the river wharf through the neighboring neighborhood to gather to eat and drink with friends. As soon as he arrived at the river wharf, he saw that Mr. Sao driving the boat had not yet arrived. There was a roadside water stall, so he went in to wait. As he walked to the wooden chair and sat down, he suddenly heard a voice in Ha's ear. Ha! Looks familiar now, is Ha the son of Mr. Ba Khan? Hearing the strange voice, he frowned and turned around to look, and in front of him was a quite old uncle. He was wearing old clothes and walking barefoot, looking at him intently. He tilted his head and looked at him questioningly. The uncle understood and smiled gently. This guy, can't you see who I am? I'm Bay Company. In the past, I and two other guys used to sneak into my house to steal fish, remember? There was a time when I caught you and now I'm going to slap your ass, remember? After listening, Ha thought for a moment and then, as if suddenly remembering, he shouted. Ah, I remember, so it's Uncle Bay. Ha! But why do you see me so well? Why don't you see that? I don't know anything about your swaggering appearance. Saying that, he looked at him from head to toe and then smacked his lips and said. Wow, I haven't seen you in a few years. You've been dressing so fancy lately, but where are you going so early in the morning? Yes, I'll go to Ha's neighborhood in a little while to have a drink because I have to go back to work tomorrow. If you're free later, come over to us for a drink. When Mr. Bay heard that, he patted Ha's shoulder and nodded with a smile. After sitting for a while, Mr. Sao, the boat driver, finally arrived. Ha immediately stood up to pay for the water and he paid it for Mr. Bay. Then the two said goodbye. Then Ha slowly walked to the parked boat, sat on the boat while waiting for a few more passengers. Ha idly looked aimlessly at the river. In the morning, the countryside was quiet and peaceful, with only the sound of waves lapping against the side of the boat. For a moment, somewhere he heard the laughter and chatter of the people working in the fields making a stir. Waiting for more than 10 minutes, seeing that there were only a few people, Mr. Sao started the boat engine and quickly ran to the shore. The boat reached the middle of the Ha River and suddenly looked up at the sky to see dark clouds coming from somewhere. The other side of the village was just drizzled with rain. After paying, Ha raised her hands to cover her head and quickly ran away. After running for a while, the rain became heavier until he passed the corner of a resident's jackfruit tree garden. He accidentally looked in and saw the base of a tall jackfruit tree with the shape of a girl standing looking out at him. Ha wondered and wanted to stop and take a closer look, but because the rain was getting heavier, he had to smack his lips and run away. When he arrived at How's house, the rain had just stopped. Just as he stood in front of the gate and was about to call in, the gate opened. Just opened. Inside, How came out and was surprised to see Ha. He frowned and said, "Hey guy, what are you doing that makes you so wet? If you keep asking, I'm afraid you guys will wait too long, so I'll come here in the rain, but let me go inside quickly. Oh, I forgot, do you have any clothes I can borrow to change into? I'm so cold after running all the way here in the rain." "Yes, okay, come in quickly." After changing clothes, from outside there was the sound of a few people cheering loudly in front of the yard. Ha and How came out and saw that it was their friends. So all that day, Ha and everyone happily ate and drank until the party ended and it was already late afternoon. After saying goodbye to everyone, Ha walked alone on the dirt road passing by the jackfruit garden in the morning. He once again saw the figure of a girl still standing under the jackfruit tree, staring at him. Under the tall jackfruit tree, its luxuriant branches and leaves obscured the weak light of the late afternoon sun, making it impossible for him to clearly see the face of the girl standing there. As he walked, he suddenly saw confused and thought to myself, "Ha! Who is standing since morning in the jackfruit garden? What are you doing? Why don't you see that person move at all? Damn it, could it be?" Thinking of this, Ha suddenly felt sober and his whole body was cold as if he were in ice water. He quickly walked to the riverbank without daring to look back. When he got home, it was already dark. Mr. Khan was so tired that he went to bed first and left the door open for him to come in. Once he had locked the door carefully, he calmly walked inside and sat down on the chair. Only then did Ha regain his composure. As she was about to reach out to pour herself a glass of water, Ha felt like someone was secretly looking at her. Feeling uncomfortable, he turned his head to the window and then he screamed in horror and fell down on the chair. Outside the window, Thanh Nhan's ghost was standing there with both hands holding the iron bars, looking at him. Her face was deformed and her head was shaking back and forth, looking very strange. Suddenly, she gently slid her arm through the window frame as if she wanted to grab him, her mouth calling out to him. "Mr. Ha, come home with me, I'm very lonely down here." Hearing Thanh Nhan's ghostly voice, he trembled in fear. Her hands groped backwards behind her stuttering mouth but no words came out. Immediately Thanh Nhan's soul slowly disappeared like night mist and then disappeared. In Mr. Khan's room, he heard a commotion and went out to see his son lying on the ground, his feet kicking repeatedly. He suddenly panicked. "Hey Ha, what's wrong? Don't make me scared." Saying that, he quickly walked over and grabbed Ha's shoulders with both hands, causing him to startle and turn his head. Looking at his face, the fear still remained. He had to reassure him 2 or 3 more times before he calmed down again. But he remained silent and did not tell him anything. After sitting for a while, he stood up and quickly went into the room despite his father's worried greetings, but Ha pretended not to hear anything. It was getting late and late. Ha lay in bed but couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, Thanh Nhan's terrifying image appeared clearly before his eyes. Ha turned left and right until there was no other way. I suddenly remembered something, so I sat up, went downstairs, took out a bottle of medicinal wine from the kitchen counter and brought it into the room. Because he had just thought of a way that if he got really drunk, he wouldn't know anything anymore. He looked at the full bottle of medicinal wine and nodded with satisfaction. Without even thinking about it, Ha opened the lid and took a big gulp. Just like that, he soon drank the whole bottle of medicinal wine. After sitting on the bed for a while, suddenly Ha's eyes started to wander and her mind kept spinning. Then it was as if there was some invisible force directing it. Ha suddenly stood up and walked unsteadily out of the room, then jumped over the fence and went straight on the dirt road, while the surrounding houses were all sleeping peacefully. Mr. Khan still didn't know when his son had gone out. On the way, Ha's eyes were still bleary and his mouth was sobbing, tilting to the right and then to the left. Until in front of him was the lakeside where Thanh Nhan died suddenly, and also where the two of them used to date in the past. As soon as they got close to the lakeside, Ha suddenly felt her whole body burning like crazy. It was a fire that quickly made my footsteps stagger close to the riverbank. Unconsciously, Ha suddenly stopped when she saw how long Thanh Nhan had been standing under the lake. Her face now looked so beautiful, her mouth smiling brightly, her hands constantly beckoning him closer, in the sparkling water illuminated. Because of the moonlit night, Thanh Nhan's eyes still looked at Ha as if captivated. He saw that, his mouth slightly opened with a smile as he moved to speak. Nan, is that you? It's Ha, I'll come to you, Nan, please wait for me. As he spoke, he stepped into the water and soon half of Ha's body was under the water's surface. But strangely, the closer Ha got, the more Thanh Nhan retreated. At that time, Ha used all her strength to lean out deeper, when suddenly a whirlpool appeared from nowhere, causing Ha to be swept away. He suddenly woke up and struggled, jumping up and down, gulping down water. Ha tried to scream for help, but it seemed like no one could hear him. Thanh Nhan's soul suddenly appeared close to Ha as if wanting to drown him. Ha used all her strength to struggle under the water, splashing foam all over the lake's surface. But gradually he seemed to be pushed further and further into the middle of the lake. After a while of struggling, Ha gradually became exhausted. The last image that Ha saw before her soul left her body was a horribly swollen and cracked face. Thanh Nhan's terrifying voice, along with a strange laugh, echoed throughout the lake. It was not until 2 days later at Mr. Khan and the people in the neighborhood found Ha's body drifting across the lake in the neighboring neighborhood. Many people in the neighborhood constantly talked about Ha's death, but most people thought that perhaps it was because he was so sad about Thanh Nhan's death that he thought about it like that. As for Mr. Khan and Ms. Vi, they thought differently, because they both understood that Ha's death was not simply a suicide but was definitely related to Thanh Nhan. Then after Ha's death the next day a newly built grave appeared next to Thanh Nhan's grave. Because Mr. Khan and Mrs. Vi wanted, whether they lived or died, to let the two of them have a beautiful, peaceful grave next to each other as a consolation for their souls. Of both to go to the other side of the world. Run out of.